Amidst the power battles in Westeros, one man rose up with a vision. A prophecy about the destruction of mankind with a single goal: to unite the seven kingdoms to face the winter that was coming. His name still echoes today in the songs and pages of the oldest chronicles, from Westeros to Essos. Aegon Targaryen, the Conqueror. But how did Aegon manage to conquer Westeros and become one of the greatest threats in history? How was he able to destroy Harrenhal and bring the King of Winterfell down to his knees? In this video, we'll be talking about the full story of Aegon's conquest. And if you like everything related to the Game of Thrones universe and the Song of Ice and Fire, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Welcome to the Three-Eyed Raven. This story begins in the ancient city of Valyria, the most powerful city in the world. A place with a lot of magic and technology that completely dominated its region in Essos. This was the origin place of the Dragon Lords, those people who could ride dragons. The Targaryens were just another family in this city, who fought for political power. However, something happened that the father of the family, Aegon Targaryen, suddenly decided to move with his family to Dragonstone. The Targaryens' rivals living in Valyria took their fleeing as a defeat. They thought that the Targaryens had accepted they would never be the most powerful family in Valyria. However, something else had happened that led them to make that decision. Daenerys, the daughter of Aegon, had the power to see the future through her dreams, and she saw how Valyria would be destroyed. Daenerys saw that the only option the family had to survive was to move to Dragonstone. Those people who mocked them and thought they had won were destroyed. The end of Valyria came with the destruction of all the dragon families, except for the Targaryens. It is uncertain what happened in Valyria, but to this day it is considered a cursed place, and from which few people return alive. For 200 years, the Targaryens ruled Dragonstone, an outpost on the gullet which allowed them to control the Blackwater Bay, and fill their coffers at the expense of the merchants that crossed it. It was also a pleasant place for dragons, as the temperatures here allowed the creatures to feel at home in Valyria. The Targaryen dominated the sky with their dragons, and their allies, the Valyrian and the Celtigar, controlled the waters of the Narrow Sea. The union of these families posed a great danger to the lords of Westeros, but even the Targaryens did not have their sights set on that side of the world. During the bloody century that followed the curse of Valyria, the Targaryen were more concerned with the affairs of the East than those of Westeros. Aemon the Glorious ruled Dragonstone after Aenar the Exiled, and was followed by a series of lords up to Aegon, the father of Aegon the Conqueror, and that's when everything changed. The person who changed the history of the Targaryen was born, and led them to conquer Westeros in an attempt to save the world. Aegon was born in Dragonstone in the year 27 before the conquest, and had two sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys. Following the ancient Valyrian tradition of intermarriage between siblings to maintain blood purity, Aegon married both sisters. It was said that he married Visenya out of obligation and Rhaenys out of love. But he would never have achieved what he did if he had not been with the two of them. The three Targaryen siblings were dragon lords who rode Balerion, the Black Dread, Vhagar and Meraxes, the two young dragons that had hatched from the egg at Dragonstone. United, the Targaryen siblings were destined to change the history of the world forever. The families at Dragonstone saw in him a young man who would be the next king of Dragonstone, but everything changed. Aegon began to have prophetic dreams about the arrival of the White Walkers. He continually dreamed that these creatures would return to the world from the darkness. Aegon saw in his vision that the only solution to save mankind was to unite the seven kingdoms of Westeros and lead them to fight the White Walkers and other threats from the north. According to Aegon, he dreamed that a Targaryen prince or princess would be the savior of the world. Aegon, understanding the importance of his vision, began to plan how he would conquer Westeros. Although rumor had it that Aegon had not set foot in Westeros until his conquest, in reality, he and his sister Visenya had visited Old Town and other places in their youth. Possibly Aegon knew that he would eventually have to attack Westeros, and was preparing by studying the cities near Dragonstone. Westeros was divided into 7 kingdoms that were constantly at war. One of the most feared kings was Harren the Black, whose cruelty was well known. Argilac, the last Storm King, feared Harren and sought an alliance with the Targaryens, offering Aegon his daughter's hand and lands in Westeros. Aegon rejected the proposal, but suggested a counteroffer. He asked Argilac to give him additional lands and for his daughter to marry Orys Baratheon, Aegon's friend. Argilac, furious, refused the deal as there were rumors that Orys was an illegitimate son and would dishonor his daughter, so he sent Aegon his messengers severed hands in response. Clearly, Aegon saw this as trouble, as a declaration of war. It is the first moment in the history of the Conqueror that he sees an enemy rising up in Westeros, and Aegon sees it as the right time to break the news to all of Westeros. Aegon summoned all his allies to Dragonstone, and once there, he told them there would be only one king in Westeros from that moment on, Aegon Targaryen, the first of his name. He sent Raven to the 7 kingdoms, and the messages read as follows. From this day forward there shall be only one king in Westeros. Those who bow to Aegon of House Targaryen will keep their lands and titles. Those who rise up against him will be defeated, humiliated, and annihilated. It is uncertain how many men accompanied Aegon and his wives. Some historians speak of thousands, others of a few hundred, but what is clear is that the power of the 3 dragons was enough to bring any city in Westeros down to its knees. With their small army, the Targaryen reached the shores of the Blackwater Delta. There, 3 hills covered with forests overlooked a fishing village. A place that helps them have access to the sea and the rest of Westeros, making it quite a strategic location. This territory had been the subject of disputes between several minor lords during the time of the 100 Kingdoms. Kings and lords such as the Darklen, the Massey, and the ancient kings of the rivers had fought for control of the mouth of the river. And there were the Targaryens claiming that place for their own. In the past, towers and forts had been erected on the 3 hills, but continuous wars and disputes had left them in ruins. When the Targaryens arrived, they found only stones and remnants of the ancient forts overgrown with brush. Although both Storm's End and Harrenhal claimed the area, there were no defenses or major castles nearby. The minor lords of the region, who lacked military power and influence, had no reason to feel any loyalty to their supposed feudal lord, Harren the Black. Thus, it became easy for the Targaryens to settle in this place, an area that became the family's most important place for hundreds of years. Aware of the strategic importance of the area, Aegon Targaryen decided to settle on the highest hill. He quickly built a palisade of mud and logs for protection, and thus was the birth of King's Landing. Aegon prepared for the greatest battle of his life, the conquest of the 7 kingdoms, to face a greater danger. After Aegon declared war on the 7 kingdoms of Westeros, he decided to send his sisters to begin this endeavor. Rhaenys went to a place northwest of King's Landing on her dragonmare axes, where the castle of the Rosby family was located. At this place, all surrendered to Rhaenys without resistance. The mere sight of the dragon's majesty was enough incentive for their surrender. But the other houses were not so easy to convince. In the regions of the Stokeworth family, as Visenya arrived at one of the castles, several crossbowmen fired at Visenya and her dragon. However, this annoyed Visenya, who unleashed the fire there. Vagar's flames burned all the roofs of the castle. Seeing the chaos, everyone surrendered to Visenya. As expected, others rose up against the new threat in Westeros. The brave ones who decided to stand up to Aegon the Conqueror were the lords called Lord Darkland from the Dark Valley and Lord Mouton of Maidenpool. In times of turbulence and conquest, these two lords decided to join forces and face the advance of the foreign invaders. With determination, they gathered an army of 3,000 men and marched south, ready to defend their land and drive the invaders back to the sea. They thought they could easily defeat Aegon since they knew Westeros very well, and Aegon only had the advantage of his dragon, or so they thought. Aegon sent his faithful friend and warrior, Orys Baratheon, to attack them on their march. Aegon knew this was a crucial battle, so he decided to take part in it as well. He mounted his mighty dragon, the Black Dread, and descended from the sky to face his enemies. The fire of the Black Dread engulfed most of the men on the battlefield in a matter of seconds. This battle was unequal. The warriors of Darkland and Mouton fought bravely, but they could do nothing against the fire of the dragon. The two lords, leaders of their respective armies, died in battle, leaving their men helpless. The sons of Darkland and Mouton, seeing the chaos of war, decided to surrender to House Targaryen by surrendering their swords and swearing allegiance to the House of the Dragon. This was the first time Aegon demonstrated his power in battle, but it was not the last time. Quickly in Westeros, the word of that disastrous battle began to spread, and the lords of the Seven Kingdoms began to fear the rising dragon in that new realm, known as King's Landing. The next step was taken by Visenya, who had her sights set on the Dark Valley. An important place because of its strategic location, but it was also a place full of treasures and riches. This was the main port of Westeros on the Narrow Sea. It had grown in size and wealth thanks to trading conducted on its shores. Merchants from distant lands arrived daily, bringing with them exotic goods and untold riches. Visenya then decided to take control of this port in order to increase the power and wealth of her family. These treasures, though abruptly obtained, were used to strengthen the Targaryen army and ensure a more stable future for the kingdom that Aegon was building. As the coffers of the conquerors filled with the riches of the Dark Valley, so did the reputation of the Targaryens grow. The people began to understand that these conquerors were not mere plunderers, but leaders with vision and determination, ready to build a lasting empire, though they also earned the hatred of those people who lost their wealth during the conquest. Aegon continued his inexorable conquest in Westeros, easily defeating the lords of the Blackwater River, who surrendered their swords to Aegon. Aegon summoned the defeated lords to come before him. Humiliated and disarmed, these lords laid their swords at Aegon's feet. However, instead of punishing them, Aegon asked them to stand up and he returned their lands and titles to them. This is the first time the men of Westeros realized that Aegon is not only blood and fire, but he was a reasonable person and would make a good king for them. Let's remember that Aegon only wished to unite the Seven Kingdoms to fight the threat coming from the north. Aegon did not wish to simply destroy everything, he wished to unify Westeros as a whole. To those who had supported him the longest, Aegon bestowed honors and important positions in his government. Thus, he appointed Daemon Valerion as Lord of the Tides and Master of Ships, Tristan Massey as Master of Laws, and Crispian Celtigar as Master of Coin. In addition, Aegon proclaimed Orys Baratheon as Hand of the King, the right hand he trusted to carry out his wishes and protect the realm. With the structure of their government already organized, they now needed a banner. It was Aegon himself who displayed his battle banner. A three-headed dragon gules on a field of sable. A blazon that had never been used before by the dragon lords of Valyria, and which was similar to other symbols of Westeros. This gesture was interpreted by the lords of Westeros as an unmistakable sign that Aegon had become one of them. A great king worthy of ruling their lands. And then came the most important moment to date, the coronation of Aegon. Queen Visenya placed upon their leader's head a Valyrian steel diadem filled with rubies. He was crowned Aegon Targaryen, the first of his name, king of all Westeros and shield of the people. It is said that all the men of King's Landing on the scene began to shout with excitement, and even the dragons joined in the celebration, roaring in unison, while Aegon was presented as king. With King's Landing as the place of departure to conquer Westeros, and Aegon crowned as king, the birth of a new kingdom under the rule of the Dragon Lords was made official, and the beginning of a great battle. A battle unlike anything they had ever seen in Westeros. But not everything was fire and blood. Many lords near this place discovered that Aegon was not as bad as they thought. He spared the lives of many and gave them back their titles, because Aegon only wishes to rule them, not destroy them. However, in different parts of Westeros, it is discussed whether they should face the young dragon, or accept his new reign. There was a king who resisted Aegon's conquest, and his story is remembered as a sign of the Targaryens' power. The 7 kings faced the threat of Aegon's dragon who sought to overthrow them. The monarchs, fearful and desperate, tried to form alliances and strategies to counteract the strength of Aegon and his dragons. But Aegon was a great military strategist, and his enemies were falling like a pack of cards, and the bank of swords in King's Landing was increasing. Aegon divided his forces into 3 by sending his sisters, the queens Rhaenys and Visenya, along with her dragons, Meraxes and Vhagar, in different directions to confront his enemies. Aegon's troops suffered casualties in difficult battles. Many times it was thought that they would not be able to continue the war, but their dragons proved to be devastating and decisive weapons. In each confrontation, the winged beasts unleashed a fiery inferno on their enemies, allowing the Targaryens to advance their conquests. This was the first time the lords of Westeros faced a war against dragons. Many were confident that their fortresses could withstand dragon fire, but they were wrong. In the midst of all this, the Rivermen led by Lord Edmund Tully rebelled against Harren the Black, their tyrannical lord. These river lords joined Aegon, pledging their allegiance and increasing his power. To continue this story, we must know who Harren the Black is, and why Harrenhal is so special. Harren the Black was the most famous member of his family, House Hoare. He was extremely powerful, but cruel to his people. Harren is described as an old and gray man, who was usually equipped with black armor. He was also extremely confident with the defenses of his castle. We must understand the paradigm shift that was occurring in Westeros in those days. Although Harren the Black was extremely powerful, he earned the hatred of his allies, who saw him as a cruel and bloodthirsty leader. The young Aegon, on the other hand, was viewed favorably, so much so that most of them switched sides. Harrenhal was the largest castle of the 7 kingdoms, located in the lands of the rivers. Harrenhal was built on the orders of Harren the Black, with the intention of having the largest stone castle in all of Westeros. Confident with the construction of his castle, Harren the Black did not fear the Targaryen dragons, but time did not prove him right. Harren the Black, cornered and outnumbered, took refuge in his giant fortress, Harrenhal. Aegon sent an emissary to parley, but Harren refused to surrender, confident that the stone walls of his castle would protect him. This overconfidence in his castle became an example of bad decisions in the future. Aegon warned that the stones were not enough protection against dragons, but Harren remained defiant. What happened next, I think, deserves to be read as told in the Book of Fire and Blood, because the conversation between Aegon and Harren was a conversation remembered throughout history. The book says the following. After Aegon had joined Edmund Tully and the other lords of the rivers in surrounding the castle, he sent a maester to its gates under a banner of peace to parley. He was met by Harren, a gray-haired older man who, even so, conveyed fierceness in his black armor. Each king was accompanied by a maester and a standard-bearer, so the words they exchanged were recorded. we must understand that Aegon's intentions were for Harren to surrender. Aegon did not wish to destroy this place, but he needed to unify the Seven Kingdoms, because a winter was coming from the north. Aegon knew that Harren the Black was the most powerful man in the region, and having him as an ally would be very important for his plans, but Harren the Black would not be so easily convinced. We can read an exchange of words between Aegon and Harren in the books, where the following is said. "Surrender now," said Aegon, "and you can remain Lord of the Iron Islands. Surrender now and your sons will live to succeed you. I have 8,000 men stationed around your wall." "What is outside my wall is not my concern," Harren replied. "These walls are strong and thick, but they are not high enough to protect you from the dragons." "Dragons fly," said Aegon. "I built them of stone," said Harren, "and stone does not burn." Annoyed and frustrated at the situation, the Conqueror took a long look at Harren and spoke a few last words to him. "When the sun sets, your lineage will be extinguished." Hearing this, Harren became annoyed and spat on the ground, then retreated back to his castle confident that his city would never fall. After all, it was the largest and best protected castle in all of Westeros. Harren then addressed a few words to his men. He said that whoever managed to bring down Aegon's dragon, he would shower him with riches. He even told them that he would grant them the hand of his enemy's daughters. What happened over the next few hours was confusing to Harren's men. Everything was silent, as if nothing was going to happen. They began to think that perhaps Aegon's words were empty. Perhaps the dragon would not attack Harrenhal. After all, this is the strongest place in all of Westeros. As Harren the Black mocked Aegon's lack of action, the young dragon soared through the skies. It is said that he rose so high in the air that from the ground he looked like an insect. Aegon climbed beyond the clouds with his dragon Balerion, and then sped down towards the castle. Harren's men, not knowing what was happening at first, felt a terrible heat coming from the sky. "Stones do not burn." It is something that Harren the Black repeated, but the fire of Balerion is something that they had never witnessed. The mere contact of Balerion's black fire melted everything in its path: the wheat, the wood, the stone of the castle, and the men who lived in it. The screams flooded the entire city. Everything burned in its path. It is said that the towers of Harrenhal glowed, as the stone reached high temperatures from the flames of Aegon's dragon. It is even said that the stone melted with the men who inhabited this castle. Balerion was enough to destroy Harrenhal. House Hor was extinguished on that day, proving that no matter how strong a fortress was, dragons were unstoppable. In Game of Thrones, there is a scene in which Tywin converses with Arya Stark where they were both at Harrenhal, talking about the day this castle was destroyed.
Harren the Black thought this castle would be his legacy. Greatest fortress ever built. Tallest towers, the strongest walls. The Great Hall had 35 hearths. 35, can you imagine? Look at it now, a blasted ruin. Do you know what happened?
Dragons?
Yes, dragons happened. Harrenhal was built to withstand an attack from the land, but an attack from the air with dragon fire. Harren and all his sons roasted alive within these walls.
Tywin Lannister was one of the cruelest and most opportunistic men in Westeros, but he was a great military strategist. Perhaps one of the best that ever lived, and he explained to Arya why that city was destroyed. This victory of Aegon at Harrenhal certainly marked a before and after in the history of the conquest. I imagine that the lords of all Westeros trembled to hear about the destruction of this castle. No one had dared to confront Harren the Black, and Aegon had not only destroyed a city that was considered impenetrable, but he had ended the lineage of this king. This was the first great victory for the House of the Dragon, but this was not the last. Chaos and ash engulfed Harrenhal as men tried to escape the heat emanating from the rocks. This act of force had alerted the lords of Westeros, who could not underestimate Aegon the Conqueror. With the defeat of House Hoare and the extinction of his lineage, King Aegon headed south and east, where the loyal vassals of the Storm King, Argilac the Arrogant, had gathered at Storm's End, an impregnable fortress in the southeastern region of Westeros. However, fate had other plans for these brave warriors, as Queen Rhaenys and her dragon Meraxes flew over their lands, watching every move of their enemy. This was a very different war than the arrogant Argilac had experienced. He was a veteran in battle, but he had never faced the strength of the dragons, nor the military power of the Targaryen family. As the Targaryen troops marched towards Storm's End, Argilac thought he could defeat King Aegon alone, and gathered his men in his stronghold. But from the air, Rhaenys watched them on her dragon and alerted Orys Baratheon to lead his troops to Storm's End, while the Targaryen men surrounded them. The story is told that old Argilac decided to be at the front lines with his men, a battle that would decide victory there. As Orys approached Argilac, the rain increased in strength as a foreshadowing of what was to follow. Argilac thought that with his men he could end the war. It is said that he had 3 times as many men as the Targaryen, but this did not frighten the Dragonblood troops. The battle lasted for hours into the night and under a storm, which must have been very difficult for the men on both sides. But the dragons gave the Targaryen the military advantage. The fight was decided when Orys met old Argilac head-on. What happened next is described in the Book of Fire and Blood and reads as follows. When Orys Baratheon descended the muddy hill with his men, he found the old king facing half a dozen men, with as many dead at his feet. "Stand aside," Orys commanded, and dismounted to face the Storm King at his height, after offering him one last chance to surrender, to which Argilac replied with an outburst. So they fought, the aged warrior king with graying hair, and the fierce hand of Aegon with his black beard. It is said that both wounded their contender, but in the end, the latter Durrandon had his death wish granted with a sword in his hand and a curse on his lips. The death of their king completely disheartened the inhabitants of Storm's End, and as the news spread, the lords and knights of Argilac threw down their swords and fled. In the dark days following Argilac's fight with Orys, some were attempting to restructure the power at Storm's End. A young woman named Argila, daughter of Argilac the Arrogant, had her heart filled with grief and rage at the death of her father and the fall of her kingdom. But she prepared a plan to hang on to power. Determined not to give up, she locked the gates of Storm's End, her ancestral home, and proclaimed herself Queen of the Storm. She was ready to resist until her last breath. She spoke to her men and warned them that those who run would pay with their lives. But a shadow began to fly over Storm's End. Queen Rhaenys, riding her majestic dragon Meraxes, flew towards the castle with the intention of speaking and convincing the woman. But the young Argila, full of pride and despair, promised the queen that she would rather die than kneel before the enemy. According to the book, she said the following. "You can take my castle," she said defiantly, "but you will only find bones, blood, and ashes." The young woman was willing to lose her life, but her men were not willing to sacrifice themselves. Many heard that Aegon the Conqueror was merciful to the survivors of Harrenhal, so they decided to open the city gates and surrender the young woman to Orys Baratheon. The men of Storm's End had treated her badly and had stripped her of her clothes. Orys was moved by the sight of her. He realized that the woman had lost everything. She had lost her family, her father, and her kingdom. First, he removed her chains and began to tell her of her father's bravery and fight, of how this old warrior almost defeated him in battle, and in a gesture of respect and honor, he offered to become the new Lord of Storm's End and take her as his wife. The defeat of Storm's End sent a clear message to the rest of the kingdoms in Westeros. You are next, and if you do not surrender, you will pay with your lives." It was then that Torrhen Stark, Lord of Winterfell, gathered with his warriors and started to create a strategy, not only to defeat Aegon the Conqueror but also to protect the Northerners. In the west, the Gardner and the Lannister houses gathered their men and began marching to confront King Aegon. Both thought that together they would defeat this new threat. The western armies began to move northwest of Westeros, in the direction of King's Landing, but this was something that Aegon knew would happen, and he was prepared for it. What happened next is one of the most exciting and shocking battles in the history of Game of Thrones, one that changed history forever. Chaos has become the everyday life of Westeros. While Aegon was preparing in his castle, waiting for the moment to march to face these two great kings, Mern IX of House Gardner and Loren Lannister joined their armies to stop the fearsome Aegon Targaryen. Their forces totaled 55,000 men, including 6,000 lords and 5,000 knights. Together they marched northwest, ready to face the enemy. This was the first time Aegon had faced such a large and powerful army. We are talking about the wealthiest families in all of Westeros. Upon hearing about the arrival of the two kings, Aegon gathered his own forces and advanced towards them. Despite having only a fifth of his enemy's men, Aegon had the advantage of speed. At the city of Stony Sept, he was joined by his two queens, Rhaenys and Visenya, mounted on their dragons. The three Targaryen together in the sky led the advance of their army. This was the ultimate advantage. Although they were fewer, they could easily destroy the enemy using the power of their dragons. The two armies met on the wide-open plain south of the Blackwater River. The two kings, confident in their numerical superiority, planned to surround Aegon on the flanks and crush his center with their iron fist, a great wedge of knights and great lords. Making the same mistake as Harren the Black, or the former Lord of Harrenhal, who underestimated the dragons. Although much of Aegon's army was composed of the Targaryens' new allies, and they were far fewer in number, the dragons alone gave them an unquantifiable superiority, and this is something they quickly realized. Aegon deployed his troops in an irregular crescent, with spearmen and pikemen in the front line, archers and crossbowmen behind, and light cavalry on both flanks. Jon Mouton, one of Aegon's first enemies who had joined his cause, was placed in command of the troops. The sky was clear on the day of the battle, the wind was blowing and the ground was dry, as it had not rained in more than 15 days. Aware of this situation, Aegon planned to use it to his advantage. At the start of the confrontation, he and his queens soared into the sky on their dragons ready to attack. The silence was most eerie, and then, the battle began with a rain of arrows that darkened the sky. The two armies clashed fiercely as the Targaryen flew over the battlefield. It was then that Aegon and his queens decided to unleash their secret weapon, Dragonfire. The three dragons launched flames on the pastures and dry wheat, creating a ravenous fire that quickly spread towards the army of the two kings. We must understand that Dragonfire is not conventional fire. It is a type of magical fire capable of melting metal and stones with the simple contact. No army had ever experienced the heat emanating from these creatures. Many of the men and horses of the two kings fled in terror, while others were consumed by the flames. Mern and Loren's iron fist crumbled under the intense heat and smoke. Aegon, Rhaenys, and Visenya continued to attack from the sky, making sure that no trace of resistance remained. This battle turned into the total destruction of the enemy army, and a further demonstration of the superiority of the Targaryen army. Fire melted the armor of the men who fell lifeless to the ground, while dragons soared through the skies and descended at full speed. By the end of the day, both armies lay in ruins. King Mern perished along with his sons and grandsons. The fire of the dragons was something they had never experienced. Loren Lannister saw that the defeat of his army was imminent, and he outsmarted the previous kings. He lowered his sword and was captured. This is the first of the Lannisters in the timeline of this universe, so this one is pretty important. What we do know is that Loren bent his knees to Aegon Targaryen, surrendered his sword and swore allegiance to him, possibly because he wished to maintain his power. Loren shares the same traits as Tywin and Cersei Lannister, so we could believe that he did it solely to preserve his power and increase his family's wealth, taking advantage of the new reign of the dragons. It is better to join the enemy than to be destroyed. However, the Lannisters did not hesitate to betray the Targaryen during Robert's rebellion, so we can say that eventually, this alliance that Aegon the Conqueror made was not all good. Aegon made him Lord of Casterly Rock after he surrendered. This established House Lannister as one of the main noble houses under Targaryen rule, which created the importance of this house in the plot of the series and the books. This means that the origin of the importance of the Lannisters was based on surrendering to Aegon and adapting at the right time. Many kings did not accept their fate and fought the dragon. However, the Lannisters were smarter and surrendered their sword, but in the future they obtained the Iron Throne. This makes the Lannister family one of the oldest players in the Game of Thrones. Aegon set off for Highgarden, where he found Harlan Tyrell, who also swore allegiance to the Conqueror and was rewarded with the lordship of Highgarden. However, the challenge was not yet over. It was Aegon's turn to march north, the place of the ancient House Stark, one of Aegon's greatest challenges. Torrhen Stark, the king in the north, had gathered an army of 30,000 men with the intention of attacking Aegon by surprise. However, Aegon heard the news about this and mounted his dragon Balerion, summoned his army and marched north. Not much is known about this king, but what we do know is he was loved and respected by the Northerners. Also, he was one of the descendants of the First Men, the same ones who came to Westeros and fought with the Children of the Forest. Torrhen began to receive news of Aegon's conquest throughout Westeros. His men and spies told him stories about how the dragon fire had melted Harrenhal, how the Field of Fire destroyed the Lannister men, and how entire families had been wiped out. Torrhen knew that this war could represent the extinction of the Starks in the north, so he gathered 30,000 men and began to march to the shores of the Trident. Aegon had continued his conquest through Westeros when he heard that the Starks were preparing for war and decided to ride his dragon with his 2 queens to face the Northerners. Torrhen Stark was determined to fight, but he really did not know what to do. He received different advice where some told him to surrender, while others claimed that the bravery of the Northerners would help him win the battle. The king's illegitimate brother named Bran Snow asked Torrhen to let him lead a group of men to slay the dragons in their sleep. But King Stark had a better idea. He sent Brandon Snow to the other side of the Trident, not to kill, but to negotiate. Accompanied by 3 maesters, Brandon carried messages between the 2 leaders throughout the night. Aegon listened carefully to the words of Brandon Snow and the maesters, and offered them a truce. After several hours of conversations, they reached an agreement. It was then when King Torrhen, the Sword in the North, decided to kneel in front of King Aegon. The book Fire and Blood says the following about that event. There, on the south shore he knelt, laid the ancient crown of the kings of Winterfell at Aegon's feet and swore allegiance to him, and stood as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, no longer as king. From that day to this day, Torrhen Stark is known as the king who kneeled. No Northerner lost his life, nor did his swords become part of the Iron Throne. The Starks had surrendered without a fight and joined the House of the Dragon. But why did this happen? What exactly happened in the conversation between the maesters, Bran and Aegon? What drove Torrhen Stark to kneel without a fight? This is certainly uncharacteristic of Northerners, but we must understand 2 things. The first is the king knew this was a losing battle. Aegon had overcome armies twice the size of the Northerners, and they had no definitive answer to the dragons. On the other hand, Aegon was not interested in destroying Winterfell. Aegon wished to unify the Seven Kingdoms because the extinction of humanity was approaching. Let us remember that what drove Aegon to conquer Westeros was not only ambition, but a dream in which he saw the destruction of mankind. But that a savior would arise, the prince that was promised, who would unify the kingdoms and fight against death itself. So the fact that Aegon was benevolent and accepted the surrender is consistent with his goals. On the other hand, the Starks had also previously fought the White Walkers, so they had a common enemy. I think Torrhen was wise, and knew the North was in great danger, and if he knelt no one would lose their lives. Perhaps he saw that Aegon was a person of honor and would keep his promises. Although of course, we cannot rule out that there was a much deeper and more mystical conversation between them about what might happen in the future. What is clear is that in the years that followed, Winterfell and the North prospered under the reign of House Stark, and the loyalty between Aegon and his descendants was unwavering. The union of these two great houses served as a reminder of the power of diplomacy and wisdom. As the years passed, the legend of the king who kneeled became a source of pride and wisdom for the North. The young men learned that courage is not only found in battle, but also in the ability to put the well-being of their people above personal pride. Something that other kings and knights of Westeros never learned, and ended up paying with their lives. Though there were those who murmured that Torrhen had been weak by kneeling, most understood that his sacrifice had prevented unnecessary slaughter, and had allowed the North to continue to prosper. The relationship between houses Stark and Targaryen remained strong and stable. An unbreakable alliance forged by mutual respect and admiration, until the time of Robert's rebellion. Rhaegar Targaryen and his forbidden relationship with Lyanna Stark ended up destroying this peace that existed in the kingdom, although there is a high probability that Rhaegar also acted under the idea of the prophecy of the prince that was promised. Which is rather ironic, since Aegon the Conqueror united the kingdoms based on this prophecy, and Rhaegar caused their division based on the same idea. But this is a topic we'll talk about in its own video. Hundreds of years later, a new king in the North had to kneel before a Targaryen conquering Westeros. This time it was Jon Snow who knelt before Daenerys Targaryen, in order to fight off the approaching threat. This means that history once again repeated itself. But this time there is something different. The Starks did not surrender Winterfell, and Sansa stayed as queen in the North. This change in dynamics could spark another war, and another rise of another dragon that brings the North to its knees again. The relationship between the Starks and the Targaryens has always been one of cooperation in the face of the end of mankind, and Jon Snow is the living example of this, born of ice and fire, the last Targaryen. After the meeting between Aegon and the Northerners, Aegon decided to separate once again from his sisters, and send them to different regions that remained to be conquered in Westeros. Aegon turned south and headed for Old Town, but not before sending Visenya to the Vale of Arryn and Rhaenys to Dorne. According to the story, Shara Arryn had prepared in the Vale to face Aegon's imminent conquest. She had deployed thousands of men at the gates of the Eyrie. But the measures Shara took to protect her realm were of no avail, for Visenya could easily evade them on her dragon, and reach the Eyrie directly. And Visenya did just that. She flew through the clouds and landed inside the Eyrie, next to the king's family quarters. That moment must have been a frightening one for Shara. Visenya had not arrived alone. She was riding Vhagar, and we can imagine the sound of Vhagar's wings alone shook the whole place. Terrified, Shara left her castle following the noise of the dragon, accompanied by dozens of men. Although the woman feared dragons from everything she had heard, she would not surrender the Eyrie so easily. But she got the biggest surprise of her life when she arrived to face Visenya, the first person she saw was her son, Ronald Arryn, the King of the Vale. The age of the child king is not specified, but it is believed that he was between 5 and 10 years old. He apparently ran into the courtyard when he heard Vhagar coming. Shara approached the dragon in terror, but noticed the boy king was sitting on Visaenia's lap, and Visaenia was smiling at him. As she approached, she listened as Visaenia told Ronald about the dragons. The boy looked at his mother and asked if she would allow him to fly with her on the dragon. This scene no doubt must have been quite confusing to the woman, for she realized that Visaenia did not wish to have a violent confrontation with her, and her son, the king, had befriended her. Shara changed her attitude and broke into a smile. What could have been a conquest with fire, and the destruction of the Vale of Arryn, became a peaceful surrender. Shara understood that it was better for the kingdom to serve the dragons. The child king lost his crown as king, but became the lord of the Vale of Arryn, and in return, Visaenia fulfilled his dream, mounted him on the back of Vhagar, and began to fly all over the kingdom. The boy became one of the few people without dragon blood to fly with Visaenia on Vhagar's back. Undoubtedly, this is something the boy never forgot, and it shows that Visaenia could be not only a weapon of destruction, but also a diplomatic queen who won the hearts of her enemies. But not only diplomacy helped in the conquest of Aegon, for prophecy and faith also played an important role. Aegon on his dragon Balerion traveled to Old Town, the city of the Hightower family. But upon arrival, Aegon met no resistance. The city gates were open. Aegon expected to find an army to fight, but found people who greeted him with respect. To understand why no one confronted Aegon in Old Town, we must understand the actions of Manfred Hightower. This gentleman was a devotee of the faith. Just as the Hightowers are in the House of the Dragon, this family is one of the leading followers of the faith of the Seven. When Manfred heard about Aegon's conquest, he asked the High Septon to pray to the 7 gods for a sign to defeat Aegon. The High Septon arrived with bad news. He told Manfred that he had a vision in which he saw all of Old Town destroyed, including the temples of the 7, and that they must surrender to Aegon because that was the god's wish. Manfred, as a good follower of his faith, surrendered all swords to Aegon, and no one lost their lives. Meanwhile, Rhaenys flew through the south and became aware of a strange mystery. In the cities where she stopped on her way to Dorne, there were only children, women, and old men. For some reason, the men were no longer in those cities, and finally when she arrived in Dorne, she was confronted by Maria Martell, a princess who had ruled all her life. She was already 80 years old, but she turned out to be much braver than many lords in Westeros, and refused to surrender to Rhaenys, even giving the young dragon a warning. The Book of Fire and Blood reads as follows. Maria Martell was 80 years old and had ruled Dorne for 60 years. She was blind, almost bald, and her skin sallow and sagging, but neither age nor blindness had clouded her mind. I will not fight you, nor bow to you. Dorne has no king, tell that to your brother, Maria told Rhaenys. That I will, Rhaenys replied. But we will return, princess, and next time we will bring fire and blood. That is your motto, said Princess Maria. Ours is never bent, never broken. You may burn us, my lady, but you will not bend us or break us. This is Dorne and you are not welcome. Come back if you dare. That must have been something of a shock for Rhaenys, to literally see an old woman in the twilight of her life defending her city, and warning them that it would not be so easy to conquer. But Rhaenys knew that the union of the 7 kingdoms was more important than the legacy of an old woman. They had to unite the 7 kingdoms for the approaching fight. The winter with the White Walkers would soon arrive in Westeros, and Aegon was against the clock. Meanwhile in Old Town, Aegon was crowned and anointed by the High Septon, declaring him king of the 7 kingdoms, and uniting the faith of the 7 with the culture of the Targaryen for the first time. This coronation marks the beginning of Aegon's reign. In the books it is said that this is where his reign begins, because it is the coronation witnessed by the maesters of the Citadel, and they consider this to be the first official coronation. Besides that, he was anointed under the faith of the Seven, a belief that unifies Westeros. Although Dorne did not surrender to the Targaryen, the conquest of Aegon was relatively easy. The hard part now would be to hold on to power. While Aegon Targaryen circled the city on his dragon Balerion and the people cheered him, in his mind was still the shadow of that prophecy. The end of humanity was near and he still had to unite a kingdom. This would be the beginning of Aegon Targaryen's reign. But what happened next? That is a story for another time. For now, this was the story of how Aegon became king of the Seven Kingdoms, and how he conquered the 6 kingdoms in Westeros, something that changed history forever. But how did Dorne join the 7 kingdoms, and what happened to Aegon after the conquest? If you would like to know this and more, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. And if you liked this content, I invite you to become a member of this channel. Each contributor will see their name at the end of all videos. And for more videos with theories, news, and stories from the Game of Thrones universe, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. You are on. The Three-Eyed Raven.